So let me start not too long ago, when it was actually April 1st, 2005. And I want to take an opportunity to thank those donors who have supported the scholarship that I received. It was April 1st, 2005, and I received a big letter in the mail. And this was one of the best days of my life because I opened this letter. Actually, I didn't need to open it. I went over to the mailbox and I saw it, and it said Stanford University on the top right. And on the front, it said, congratulations. So it let the cat out of the bag. And I remember getting it and holding it and thinking about flashes of my future and what this would mean for a student like me coming from a neighborhood that didn't see a lot of college graduates. So the first instinct that I had that day, it was to run around my house, and immediately my mom was worried about me because I was running around and screaming and yelling, so excited about what this meant for me. And so she came up, she said, "What's going on?" And I said, "Look, I got into Stanford. I got into Stanford University." And her immediate reaction was of course, see, my mom, I have to tell you just a little bit about my mother. She never went to college. In fact, she never made it past the 8th grade. So for her, the concept of college was new, and when I was applying, a lot of things were new in that process. But the first question she asked was, "Is Stanford a good school?" And I said, it's a great school, and I'm going to get the opportunity to go off and study with some great minds. And the second question she asked was, "Where is Stanford?" And I told her it's in California. And in her head, I could see processing the geographic location of the U.S., and she said, "Is that far?" And I said, "It's as far as I could get." And so immediately, she started crying, thinking about losing her oldest boy. I'm one of 5. And she said, okay. She was processing all the information. She asked, "Where specifically in California is it?" And I said, "It's in Palo Alto, California." And just like mothers do, she was an immediate problem solver. And she said, "Well, you don't need to go all the way to Palo Alto, California. We have Palo Alto in our backyard. And you can go there and enroll and it'll be just as good." And I literally live 2 blocks away from Palo Alto College. And so I think about that because we were going through a lot of news, a lot of new experiences, a lot of new questions that we didn't have answers to. And one of those questions was how we were going to pay for college. My mom had never seen a number as big as the tuition for Stanford for 1 year, which was $65,000 that year. And collectively, my parents that year, and I know this because as all students here know, we have to fill out our financial aid forms. And collectively, my parents made about $25,000 for a family of 7. That was below the poverty line. And so we were discussing questions about how to make things manageable for us. And it was through the sheer blessing of the San Antonio Area Foundation and the scholarships. Once we did get our financial aid package back, there was a gap that we had to cover, and it made that gap manageable. It made the cost of airfare manageable. In fact, the first time I'd ever gotten on a plane, I was 18, and it made those experiences much easier without the weight of the financial obligations of how I was going to pay for college. And I tell you that story because that is a story that's very similar to a lot of young people in San Antonio. And in fact, it's oftentimes some of the reason folks don't apply for college. And I've heard several stories now that I've been on the council, and I've had the opportunity to talk to a lot of young people who have had the opportunity to go to far off places, even Ivy League schools, who, because they didn't ask the right questions, because they didn't run into the generosity of folks like the donors in this room or the scholarships that you fund, have decided that it might be easier to play it safe and stay close to home. And if there is anything that I have learned in my long life of 29 years, it is that there is a secret sauce to success that oftentimes requires a lot of fear and anxiety. And it's similar to the feeling that I think some of you all have. Some of you who will be freshmen next year, I'm actually envious. I'm envious of all of you students who are still in college because those are some of the best years of my life, but I can still imagine the brew of feelings that you feel when you're off to college for the first time, or when you're going back to college after coming home. It's this anxiety, it's this fear, it's an excitement, it's a mixture of so many feelings all happening at once that I'm envious because there's not many opportunities to feel that same feeling after you finish up college. And speaking from personal experience, the times that I have felt that before have been the same feelings I had before I decided to run for office. The anxiety, the fear, the risk. Luckily, you don't have to deal with the whole doors getting slammed in your face situation of running a campaign. And it's the same feeling I got when I got married, anxiety and fear. But you don't have to deal with all the loss of independence when you're on your way to college. I invited my wife, but she wasn't able to make it this morning. But I say all this because there's a sense of motivation that is involved in all those feelings, the sense of anxiety, of fear, of excitement. And it's that motivation that's oftentimes pushing a lot of students to test their boundaries and put themselves outside of their comfort zone. So if there's anything that I have learned, it's that I've been incredibly lucky. But there's a thing about luck, and I use the word luck intentionally because most folks define that as a sense of probability or randomness, something that doesn't require effort. But luck does require effort because you need to put yourself in a position to get lucky. And oftentimes, putting yourself in that position is some of the hardest parts of success. Putting yourself into an interview that you're afraid of, going to a college and taking courses that are challenging. In fact, I felt that same sense of pressure that I'm sure some of you who are coming back from college have already experienced, where you're sitting in class and you're thinking to yourself, it is a mistake that I am sitting in here. I was in my first math class. It was multivariable calculus at Stanford. And I remember we were in an auditorium just like this. And everybody was really impressed because at the bottom row, there was a young man who was impressing everybody with his mathematical feats. And he was doing a Rubik's Cube in 30 seconds. But what really struck me is that after a while, they challenged him to do it behind his back. And he was doing a Rubik's Cube behind his back, and I said very quickly, I am in the wrong classroom. And I tell you that story because I was so afraid of being exposed as a pretender. You see, my life, and I consider myself lucky, it has been a sense of putting myself in positions that I felt terribly uncomfortable for somebody who was a first-generation high school graduate, first in their family to go to college. In fact, I'm a first-generation American, and that my father came to this country as an undocumented immigrant way back in the 1980s. So when I think about luck in my life, it actually started before I was even born. When my father came here to this country, chasing something for him and his future, and for his siblings, for his children, so that I could benefit from his luck. He was lucky enough to become an American citizen after several years of finding himself in tough jobs. And I think about his sacrifice, and I say it, and I tell that story much easier than I used to when I was a young student. In fact, I was oftentimes ashamed to admit that about my family or our circumstances. But it gives me so much pride because it reminds me of what it means to be an American and have access to something that we all have access to that we might take for granted, which is the American dream. The sense that your children and that your generation and that your students who are here are going to have a better life than you've had. And it's been an incredible journey of luck for me my entire life that I have been able to take advantage of opportunities that, but for a quick decision of not wanting to take the path of most resistance, in fact, the path of least resistance often seems very comfortable and a very cozy position to put yourself in. That was a decision I had to make after I graduated from Stanford in 2010. And I wanted to come back to San Antonio. And I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do, but I knew that I wanted to give back in a way to San Antonio because it was part of who I was. And it was a strange feeling because flying at 18 in a plane for the very first time, I thought that San Antonio was in my rear view mirror, that I would never come back to San Antonio. In fact, I'll be very honest and admit that when I received that letter from Stanford, I thought that this was my ticket out. This was my ticket out, and I was going to grow up and be rich and have a fancy car and do all the things I thought were going to make me happy. And I think sometimes growing up in places like the south side of San Antonio or the neighborhoods that I'm from, it felt that way to be successful, that you had to have riches to be a success in life. And it wasn't until going through college and meeting folks and experiencing the lives of other people that I realized that all I wanted to do was want to come back to San Antonio and serve in some capacity. So I realized that I needed to put myself in a position to get lucky. And in 2011, against all odds, folks told me you should not be running for city council. You're 23. You've got no ability to raise money or run a campaign. And that was no more true than the very first door that I knocked on. In fact, it put everything into light that I was in a position that either I was going to fail miserably or succeed masterfully. I knock on my first door, and like a good candidate, I've got the names of everybody whose door I'm knocking on, and I'm knocking on Miss Rodriguez's door. She's 72. She's a consistent voter, so I'm at her doorstep, and I knock that morning. She comes to the front, and I quickly get my pitch out before she slams the door, and she says, yes. And I say, I'm so sorry, Ms. Rodriguez, for interrupting your Saturday. I want to introduce myself. My name is Saldana. I'm running for city council. Was born and raised here on the South Side, graduated from South Side, went to Stanford, came back. I want to serve you on the city council. And she stopped and paused and looked at me for several seconds, and she said, now, did you say you're running for the city council or the student council? Because you're certainly not old enough to be city councilman. And I realized then, that was the first door I knocked on, remember, that I had 3,000 more doors to knock on if I was going to be successful. And oftentimes we don't realize it when we're in the position where we feel uncomfortable and we're on our way to preparing for an interview, or we're on our way to a college campus that we've never set foot on, around students who are all academically brilliant, that we don't realize that we're putting ourselves at risk of failing, but we're putting ourselves at risk of succeeding greatly. And I've had every opportunity to fail, but I've also had every opportunity to succeed. And I get to do a job now that is getting to come back and serve San Antonio, and at an age where you don't see many young city council members. But what it meant to me is the message that I'll close with, which is that you have to define what you're passionate about. You have to define what your career will ultimately be. But for me, I read this passage by Horace Mann, who was an educator in the early 19th century, who said that you should be ashamed to die until you have won some victory for mankind. I use that phrase because it is a victory that donors in this room have been part of in getting to see their benefit from the students who are up on the stage like Nicole, or who are sitting with you in the crowd. I use that phrase of finding your victory because it is the students who are going through that process now. And I use that phrase because there are some parents whose biggest victory, and I'm looking at some of them now, is the greatness that their students are going to dispel on their communities, their country, and the world. And so I'm excited to say thank you, because oftentimes I've been the beneficiary of scholarships with names on them, with folks whose faces I couldn't really identify or encapsulate into a real image. But I get to do that here today with the San Antonio Area Foundation, for an organization that has been doing great things for such a long time, and at least in my case, for somebody whose odds when he began life shouldn't have been one that is standing in front of you as a first-generation American, somebody who didn't speak English coming into pre-K, somebody whose parents didn't make it past the 8th grade and didn't make much money. But I get to be here in front of you all on a Saturday and say thank you so much for your commitment. Thank you, students, for your commitment to your futures. And thank you again to the donors of the San Antonio Area Foundation.